I have this thing where like, look at what's happening, listen to what's happening, and feel what's happening.
It's this gut thing, you can feel it just feels wrong, and it's hard to explain that.
What this show is about is me and a guest of mine. We're editors, and we will talk about the editing that we see in movies, scripted movies, documentaries, reality TV, and short films. So whatever is really interesting, we're going to talk about it and dissect the editing.
Hey guys, my name is Patrick Devaney. I've been a freelance video editor in San Francisco for the past 4 years, and I'm in LA here talking with Reid, and thanks for having me.
What I want to talk about is the short film Dawn of the Deaf. I myself have a severe to profound hearing loss. Any kind of media that features deaf characters and really shows the audience or the reader that perspective is really interesting to me, because I can, for one thing, relate to that experience very closely. When I saw this film, I thought it was extremely well done, and the sound design is just super interesting. Let's just briefly go over who made the film. So Rob Savage is the writer and director, and Riccardo Servini is the editor, and Calum Sample is the sound designer. So one thing that I do need to mention, I want to give a trigger warning. There's a lot of discussion in the news right now about sexual assault and rape, unfortunately, and this film does cover that subject matter in pretty graphic detail. So do want to just put that trigger warning out there for you all, so I know a lot of people are having a difficult time right now. Yeah, let's get right into it and discuss the editing.
I believe it's the first shot of the daughter is behind her back, and then it crossfades to in front of her face. And that struck me as interesting because that's a continuity edit, but with the crossfade it was a little bit unnerving because you don't necessarily need a crossfade.
And it takes a long time. It's a long crossfade.
It's a long crossfade, and something about it is disrupting. And so I think that adds to the mood, and you know right away that something with her is a little off, and you don't know exactly yet. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a good strategy, to be able to plant that clue to the audience. And then the father interrupts the frame and completely blocks her. And that's not something I noticed the first time, but when I watched it again, we see her and she's not looking too happy, and then he comes in and sits down, so he
Nothing for Sam.
interrupts her space.
You're so good with her. So I'll be home about 7, 8 at the latest, so just put the oven on.
I never thought of it that way, but that one shot selection could be a metaphor for him interrupting her life and her safety, and as we'll see later on in the film.
Just saying goodbye.
Bye. Bye, love.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like that's something that they're prepping us for,
Right.
training the audience that that's what they're going to do.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, you definitely want to have a consistent visual style in your edits, and so that's something that they've done here. They use a lot of so-called found footage type, with the pranksters, and so anytime that you see pranksters in this short film trying to play pranks on deaf people, it's always in this, low resolution, found footage, handycam style. So that's very consistent, so you know immediately what that's all about.
Now, why do you think they use the found footage style as opposed to just showing them filming?
It's about perspective. These shots, they're from a first-person perspective.
Mm-hmm.
They also, give us an interesting perspective with the deaf character. So maybe that was a philosophy with the director. These guys are pulling pranks, and so there's a lot of YouTube videos and YouTubers where people will film themselves doing pranks, and so this kind of fits within that genre and like what people actually do, so it's more authentic.
I guess the found footage can add to the feeling of being watched, being laughed at. So we're definitely not seeing the deaf perspective in this scene. We're seeing, you know, the bully perspective. We're seeing people watching them and judging them from afar.
Right, and it's voyeuristic. Like, this is a horror film. For us to witness somebody else's misery as from afar, and that's what this gives us. That creates fear, that creates tension.
One could say that they put the frame down in a little box because they're trying to illustrate the nature of the found footage, but it can also be represented as, you know, making you feel helpless, like you're watching something that you can't do anything about.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, it's constricted, it's confined. That definitely creates tension. The main thing about this cafe scene between these two lovers, they're dating, they're obviously together, is the sound design. Like, that's immediately what pops up, and I love it. I think it's really interesting, and of course you can't have zero sound in a scene like this, so they do add some sound, and we can see that they're signing and they're deaf. And so we hear from their perspective that the world is very muted and muffled. And there's a shot later on in the scene where a bus drives by in the background, and you expect that when you see that you're going to hear a loud roar, but you actually don't hear that much of an increase in the sound, which is, you know, really authentic. And in a place like this, you normally would hear like chairs moving backwards, plates clinking, and those are high-pitched sounds, and if you're deaf, you're not going to hear those really well. And it really gives you that perspective, that sort of inside look into their world. You know, even though I said, like, you know, you can't have a film, a scene where there's no sound. Well, just recently, earlier this week, I saw A Quiet Place, and they did do that. And you saw the film, right?
Yeah, it's a fantastic movie, and I saw a featurette in which the director mentioned that there were some scenes when they were putting the perspective in one of the characters who is deaf, and they actually removed all sound design altogether, which you don't ever see in film ever. So
Right. Yeah, and so the screening that I went to last week, they talked about that, and what I noticed, like, the reason they more talked about their fear of doing that and having people say, you know, in the theater, like, oh my god, the sound's out, I want my money back, this isn't working. They talked about that fear, but the reason it worked, I feel like the reason it worked is they created a visual language that what you hear from that deaf person's perspective is because of the device that she wears, the hearing aid and the cochlear implant. And they actually show at some point her taking it off, and then the sound cuts out completely. And so you have that visual connection, and you understand this is why we're not hearing anything.
Right.
And that way, you know, like, okay, this isn't a problem. There's a logical explanation for why this is. But in this scene with the two deaf people, they don't give you that visual language other than the sign language. And so I still feel like it was the right choice to have some sound.
Well, you bring up a good point where sound design and also video editing in general is all about setting up rules and showing the audience the rules so that, you know, they know what to expect, and then you may break them later. The daughter is listening to the radio,
Right.
and we hear the audio as it is diegetically, and then we hear the song through her vibrations as she, touches the radio.
So before we get to that bedroom scene, there's a speech scene, and at the end of that, just before that scene ends, we hear music come in. And so that music comes in non-diegetically. Nobody else at that award ceremony is hearing that music. And Stranger Things does the same thing, where they'll play music at the end of one scene, and then when it transitions into the other scene, that non-diegetic music becomes diegetic. It's part of the world.
Right.
And so that scene that you're talking about in the bedroom, it gets really, really creepy. It's very slow paced, so that you can see all of the placement of his hand on her back and on her arm. And it's this slowly building tension of like, oh crap, like we know what's gonna happen.
It's the drums.
Yeah, I like what you said about the pacing, because I didn't notice that before, but now that you mention it, it seems like he's doing this very, forceful, violent thing in an extremely slow, setting, where he's forcing her head over, but he's doing it very slow and deliberately. And these are slow, intimate shots, but in this situation, they become very uncomfortable.
Right. And the shallow depth of field, I think, really connects with that intimacy and that violation of personal space. Okay, this subway scene, this is really one of my favorite scenes.
Well, it's the climax of the movie, and it's got to be this gripping scene. And they made a lot of strong, interesting decisions.
From a cinematography standpoint, of course, it's brilliant that the camera is just rotating around them. It's all one long take. There's really no editing, except for the fact, so the text that we see that's subtitling their sign language, of course the sign language is diegetic. All other characters can see that. The text gets obscured as the camera is rotating around the characters, and their backs are obscuring the other person's hand, and so the subtitle text as well gets obscured. And I love that connection, and that editing of that text, it really created a sense of loss of control for me, and it really just like upped my anxiety and that kind of stress. And so that's what that scene did for me.
So I rewatched it because I was wondering if they had, snuck in this horrible thing with all these people falling as they're talking and we don't notice. Unfortunately, they did it off camera.
Right.
There's a interesting study. They tell you to pay attention to people throwing a ball, and you're supposed to count the amount of throws. Right. And then they tell you to watch it again, and there is a guy in a gorilla suit who walks in between the people throwing the balls, and I personally had never noticed the gorilla. It's because apparently we have selective vision.
Right.
So when you're paying attention to something so intently, you don't notice other information. When I watched it the second time, that hopefully they would, have a similar effect. They got such a intent, such a level of attention put on one particular subject that, they could have put an explosion or something in the background. We wouldn't have noticed it.
Yeah. The next thing that I want to talk about is it's right after that tunnel scene.
It's showing all three story points right before their climaxes.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing all of their, most emotional as they're all coming to their peaks.
One thing that I noticed that was really interesting, towards the end of it, a guy is going to jump over the wall, and the camera movement does the same thing going down, so that's a match cut on motion.
Right.
That I noticed.
The camera comes over in a swooping manner as he jumps over, and that's when we see the father, lunged over in a very aggressive position.
There's another match cut, but it's a match cut on shape. She starts to reach for a knife, and we see a glint. And then it cuts to the award ceremony, and we see a similar shape of a glint, something shiny, and it slowly, the blurriness focuses on a champagne glass.
Right.
And so I thought there was really interesting ways. Like I personally love match cuts. Like it's like when I watch something and I notice it, it's like I discovered an Easter egg or something. So those tend to jump out at me.
Yeah. So this is a scene that's, you know, the darkest scene in the movie, the most uncomfortable. It's not a fun scene to talk about. One of the things that I notice is the camera moment. The cuts are incongruent. They don't exactly line up. It will go from him unbuttoning his shirt to him already sitting up. They're using that to break continuity to make you uncomfortable.
Right.
Because continuity, it ties everything together, so you don't even notice when there's a cut, and when you break that, it's very jarring. And you can do that to create a specific emotion. And so this is definitely just making us, you know, putting us in her perspective and making us feel as uncomfortable as they're able to, you know. And it's just very quick cuts, it'll cut away just when there's movement to no movement, and it makes it, you know, very jarring. And you might not, you know, notice it, but that's the feeling that you're getting is, you know, this clinch and, you know,
Right.
when it cuts. That's what I noticed in this scene. And it's funny because you mentioned that the previous scene with them was a lot slower and a lot more methodical, and it's just as creepy, but this is a different, you know, they've upped the escalation and upped the, you know, the shot. So they're cutting a lot more frequently, so it's, you know, it's definitely,
Yeah, the pacing is quicker.
yeah.
But it's not, as you're saying, it's not smooth and flowing.
Mm-hmm.
It's jarring and it's abrupt and violent. And the pacing of it definitely quickens towards the end of it. You know, it goes from the girls in the tunnel to the pranksters to the rape to the speech to the pranksters to the rape. And, you know, at the end, like it gets faster and more rapid. And then it just cuts into the next sequence, as I call it.
Right.
The end sequence, and it just really slows down, really quiet. We see the aftermath. And so we have that time to process, this is a really violent, disturbing scene. And so as a viewer, we need time to process and just kind of take a breather from that.
Well, we see the escalation of the scenes. You know, it's interesting because it starts out, we get the shot in the tunnel of the dead bodies, and then we get the, you know, the father and daughter scene as the rape starts, and then she grabs the knife, and that's when we see the glass breaks, and then she kills him before she knows, you know, what is happening.
Right.
And we cut away from it so quick that it's almost like we didn't have time to process it. And then it cuts to the more slower scenes, and we see the stillness and the quietness.
Right.
And I would argue that although we have time to process it, because it abruptly slows down, it also adds to this what the hell just happened feeling. You know.
For me, it felt like the calm before the storm.
Yeah.
Something bad happened, and it got really calm, and we know okay, something even worse is about to happen. And then we start to see the zombies start to awaken, and we're like, oh shit, this is bad. So that's our show for today. Definitely want to thank Rob Savage and Riccardo Servini for allowing us to feature their short film on the show. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I definitely enjoyed our conversation. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun. I hope to do it again. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and click the bell.